parce que tu as su mêler la science et l'émotion. Et puis, pour une raison un peu spéciale, c'est que je pense que le but de nos rencontres, c'est aussi que les sociétés puissent expliquer un peu ce qu'elles fabriquent, ce qu'elles font. Et tu as centré ta présentation sur l'Institut et au fond sur ton action, puisque tu es le père de la résolution de l'Institut et de la résolution de l'Assemblée générale. Et je pense qu'il est important de retenir la leçon du poète mauritanien aussi, l'irruption des considérations élémentaires d'humanité dans le droit qui est une discipline un peu sèche. L'orateur suivant est Jean-Marc Thouvenin, qui va présenter un sujet un peu plus spécifique, mais qui entre dans ce cadre général, puisqu'il va parler des migrations climatiques, dont on a un peu aussi entendu parler par ailleurs ce matin. Jean-Marc est professeur dans ma bien-aimée université, je pense qu'on peut dire notre bien-aimée université, qui n'est pas l'université de Paris-Ouest Nanterre, mais comme je l'ai indiqué plusieurs fois aux organisateurs, l'université de Paris-Nanterre, où il a été le très efficace directeur du Centre de droit international de 2008 à 2016, qui est un centre très, très dynamique. Il est spécialiste à la fois, et c'est quelque chose que j'admire beaucoup, il est spécialiste à la fois de droit européen et de droit de l'Union européenne et de droit public international public, alors qu'à mon avis, ce sont deux disciplines complètement distinctes et dont la méthodologie est vraiment différente. Il est à la fois un scholar, j'avais mis en anglais, un universitaire et un praticien, puisque il est avocat inscrit au barreau de Paris et il est un conseil très fréquent devant la Cour internationale de justice notamment. Il y représente en particulier à l'heure actuelle l'Ukraine, ainsi d'ailleurs que d'autres pays. Et depuis 2017, Jean-Marc est le secrétaire général de l'Académie de droit international de la Hague. Jean-Marc, tu as la parole en espérant qu'elle sera utilisée dans une langue raisonnable.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, cher ami. I'm a specialist of nothing, as you understood. I'm as generalist as Alain, but with less talent, of course. So my topic is climate migrations, and I'm not a specialist of that. So one of the questions I had in mind when I took this subject was whether it would be relevant to present some reflection to the Institut de droit international on the subject, right? I'm a young member of the Institut de droit international. 57 is my age, but I've been elected in 2019, so I'm a young member of the Institute. And perhaps I was thinking it would be a topic for the Institute. I'm not sure, finally. There can be many reasons pushing a person to flee from his or her home, to search for another country to live temporarily or permanently. Work, economic conditions, family reasons. There can be many reasons, and normally we call it voluntary migration. It can be queried, but that's more of a voluntary migration in the classical way of presenting it. Some migrations are forced, of course, in case of a conflict, political persecution, terrorism in certain places. Natural disaster can force someone to flee from his home. And of course, climate change can also have an impact on migrations. Now, climate change as a direct and exclusive cause for migration is uneasy to evidence, and perhaps it's even impossible to evidence. Save in certain cases where, for example, a country completely disappears under the waters, which is something that will perhaps happen in the future. But in practice, when someone flees from his homeland, it's often because several reasons concur to such a decision. If a person sees her habitat destroyed by a hurricane or a flooding, this person could search another location in the same country. Going to the capital, for example. So perhaps in Peru, some people flee from their home city to come to the capital Lima because they don't think they don't find a reasonable condition of living there. So fleeing the country needs something more. Perhaps when the country is under economic pressure, if there is no decent housing in the country to host the people moving inside the country, and in these situations, well, yeah, there could be a migration. So, is a person moving into the country, into his own country, because of climate change, and then because the country does not offer correct housing, goes away? Is this person a climate migrant? Well, I think we can say yes. But not only, and that perhaps is the issue here. However, even if it's complicated to define or isolate what is a pure climate migrant, what seems certain is that climate change has an effect and will have an effect on migration. It will increase global migrations. Some projection says 1 billion people will be abroad because of climate change. Well, that's a lot. Some projections say, well, 150 million people. And it seems that a reasonable projection would say 200 million people will fly away from their country because of climate change. Well, in fact, no one knows. That's the thing. And no one knows what will be the situation in 2030, 2050, in particular because we can do things in between. We can act. We can cope with the situation and try to not resolve the situation, but take into account the situation and try to do something. Well, doing something. Okay, what? So let's look at hard law. Is international law offering any tool in this regard? So, of course, yes. International law has things to say. And I heard about the status of refugees. Now, of course, the status of refugee can be a tool for helping climate migrants, even if impure climate migrants, to see their humanity protected. Well, of course, to be a refugee, you must be persecuted for certain reasons, and climate change is not a reason for claiming a kind of a persecution. But let's assume that it can be useful, for example, when someone moving inside the country because of climate change is not supported by the country, by the government, for ethnical reasons, for political reasons, for any reason that is covered by the Refugees Convention. In this case, perhaps, yes, it could be a refugee under the 1951 Convention. Of course, there is also the African Union approach of the notion of refugee, which includes a larger category of persons that can benefit from the Refugee Convention. And there is also the Cartagena Declaration that I assume you know very well here. Cartagena Declaration, which has been included in domestic laws in, I think, 14 countries. So that means that these countries are more open to give the status of refugee to people fleeing because of political turmoil or civil unrest because of climate change and global warming. So refugees, yes, status of refugees can be helpful. Of course, human rights can also apply and be helpful for the climate migrants, for them to be protected. In this regard, I think that you all know the case of Viauane Taitiota. You know this person, a person who sought protection in New Zealand from return to Kiribati due to the impact of climate change there. So basically the person was in New Zealand saying, you cannot send me back to Kiribati because I cannot live correctly because of the climate change in Kiribati. New Zealand refused to this claim, but the UN Human Rights Committee was seized of the matter and held in 2020 that states must, and I quote, states must refrain from deporting an individual when there are substantial grounds for believing there is a real risk of irreparable harm, such as that contemplated by Article 6 and 7, so right to life and protection against torture, etc., of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And the UN committee further held that, I quote, without robust national and international efforts, the effect of climate change in receiving states may expose an individual to a violation of its rights under Article 6 and 7 of the Covenant, thereby triggering the non-refoulement obligation of sending state. So, very interesting. There can be an obligation of non-refoulement of someone if its country is submitted to difficulties because of climate change. Very interesting. Well, so much for hard law for me, even if there is some inspiration to get out from these cases, perhaps it's not the best solution to focus on. And when one look at the current policy of the international community regarding climate migrations, the focus is not on adopting new conventions. For example, we talked about BBNG, Plastic Convention, very important. Here, there is nothing like trying to adopt new conventions for climate migrants, at least as far as I know. But there are many, many initiatives. And the multilateralism, as we said this morning, is very much alive in this regard. And so I could mention many initiatives taken by different international organizations, International Organization of Migrations, the UN, of course, but also states acting in different forums and different groups. One of the interesting ones is the Nansen Initiative. Perhaps you heard of that, the Nansen Initiative, which is an initiative from different states, and it has been prolonged by another initiative, which name I will not give to you because I don't have time. So this is a policy, states trying to convince themselves to change their view, to change their approach of the migrants, and to see them as human beings rather than as people coming to take the food from the people already living there. Many initiatives, and I think it's working quite well. And I finish by, 10 minutes is short, but this morning I rounded 2 minutes to the panelists, so perhaps I could have a discount. Okay, so I just finished with mentioning the Vanuatu initiative. So coming back to my obsessions on the advisory opinion. So look at the questions put by the Vanuatu and the group of states supporting the initiative that will go to the ICG at the end of the month. So basically the question is, do states not respecting their climate commitments owe something to climate migrants? That is one of the questions put to the court. It will be interesting to follow that. Thank you.
It was okay. You did not even need your 2 minutes. Merci beaucoup. À part la langue, j'ai trouvé l'exposé intéressant. Je pense que surtout ce que j'en tire, c'est que tout est un peu dans le tout. Et on ne peut pas ne parler que des climate change tout seul. C'est lié à des problèmes de droits de l'homme, c'est lié à des tas de problèmes de droit international. Et je pense que notre oratrice suivante va confirmer cette impression.